Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our third video in this series on Paul the Apostle, from Saul the Pharisee to Paul the Apostle. I'm glad that you've joined us. Today I want to talk just a little bit more about Paul's letters that make up about half of our New Testament, our Christian Testament. Talk about those letters, and then also I want to talk a little bit more about the relationship of the book of Acts, which really describes Paul's ministry, and how many biblical scholars like to try to sync up what Paul says in his letters and what Luke, who wrote Acts, the historian, if he can sync up those journeys. And we'll talk a little bit about Paul's journey. So that's where we're going to go today. And then in our next video, then I want to focus in on 3 or 4 of Paul's main theological points. So Paul's writings, you've probably heard the word epistle, which is basically an anglicized form of the Greek word epistle, which means a letter. And we know that there are 13 epistles or 13 letters in our New Testament that are attributed to Paul. But again, 3 or 4 of them it's doubtful that all of them in their entirety were written by Paul. Maybe some of it and the rest of it was written by one of his disciples. We're not sure. Most of these letters are written as responses to something that was going on in these Christian congregations that Paul founded throughout the Mediterranean area. Some theological issue, and Paul is writing from a distance, addressing that theological issue or that problem and often it was a problem in those churches, or encouraging one church to be generous and support another one, etc., etc. But Paul founded those churches, and all these letters really are written as a response to an issue going on in one or several of them together. In order of appearance in the New Testament, these are Paul's letters, or again, the letters that are attributed to him. First of all, his magnum opus, which was the book of Romans, and then next is 1st and 2nd Corinthians. There's 2 different letters. The book of Galatians, Ephesians, then Philippians, the book of Colossians, then 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, the little tiny book of Titus, and the little tiny book of Philemon. In chronological order, or the order of dating, and by the way, Paul's writings in the New Testament are the oldest writings that are present there. In other words, Paul's writings existed before the Gospels were written. Paul's writings probably go back to the 40s and 50s, or the early 50s anyway. The Gospels were not written until probably the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even later. So Paul's writings were really the first Christian documents other than the Hebrew Bible. So we believe that 1 Thessalonians is the oldest, and if my memory is correct, I believe the oldest fragment of Scripture, again, not the original letter, but the oldest fragment of one of the copies of the original letters, is a little piece from 1 Thessalonians. I believe I'm correct with that. So 1 Thessalonians was probably one of the first letters he wrote, and then the book of Galatians, and then Corinthians, Philemon, Philippians, and Romans. His later writings are often the ones that are disputed, and those are the book of Colossians, Ephesians, and 2 Thessalonians. And then there's this other little group that I mentioned that most scholars agreed Paul did not write them, but they were written by his disciples. And those are what are sometimes called the Pastoral Letters. They were written to pastors about pastoral issues. And that's 1st and 2nd Timothy. Remember, Timothy was one of Paul's student disciples, and the book of Titus. We're almost certain Paul did not write those letters. And how do we know that? Because the Greek and the writing is so different. The grammar is so different. It looks nothing like the Greek and the grammar of Romans, etc. But if you really want to know about Paul's life and the sort of ministry that he conducted, you have to go to none other than the Acts of the Apostles, again written by Luke. The Acts of the Apostles is really this volume number 2 of a two-part volume written by Luke. And it's a continuation of Luke's gospel. So it's Luke's gospel and then the Acts of the Apostles. And again, much of the material in the Acts of the Apostles are about none other than Paul and Peter, okay? Paul and Peter. But in the Acts of the Apostles are described all those journeys, those missionary journeys that Paul took. So the book of Acts, or the Acts of the Apostles, is really like a history book. It's one of my favorite books in the New Testament. It's really exciting, and it's all about this new, young movement within Judaism that is convinced that Jesus was raised from the dead and that his spirit was alive in the world, and this new thing that was happening, this new discovery of God's grace being meant for the entire world. And it's all about those two apostles, Peter and Paul. The book of Acts also records Paul's mystical conversion experience on the road to Damascus. All that is in the book of Acts, although he does mention it in some of his letters, but it's really described in detail in the book of Acts. And also the book of Acts includes Paul's final journey to Rome. And he was not going there under his own steam. He was being taken there for trial. And why was Paul being tried? It was for political sedition. Why? Because Paul said over and over that Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not. So after a while, the authorities, the Roman authorities, wanted to put an end to his ministry. I'm sure they were aided and abetted by leaders of the temple in Jerusalem, but eventually they wanted to get rid of Paul because he was becoming a real problem. And it does include the story of his trip to Rome. It does not include his death. It is believed that Paul died in Rome, but the book of Acts does not include it. It just doesn't include that part of it. So the challenge and the fun for a lot of biblical scholar geeks is to try to synthesize the stories of Paul's journeys and his work in the book of Acts with his letters to these churches. And some of it does sync up pretty nicely, and other stuff not as well. Also, just know that when Paul is preaching and teaching, he often refers or gets his authority from what? The Hebrew Bible. Paul was a Jewish Pharisee. And so his Bible was the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament. So often he'll be quoting from prophets, and he proves his point in places like the book of Romans. He proves his points by referring to the Hebrew Bible. He really did. He knew his Bible. He knew his scriptures. The word apostle, we hear that a lot. It's a church word. What does that mean? The word apostle means one who is sent, one who is sent. And the criteria used to call an apostle, at least in the early church, was someone who had known and followed Jesus in the flesh. In other words, when Jesus was conducting his ministry, those who followed him, that inner group of 12, they became apostles. That was the first criteria. And then the other criteria was someone who received his command following his resurrection appearances, to go into the world and preach the gospel. Those were the two criteria that were used to call somebody apostle. And the constant controversy in the early church was, well, Paul is not a legitimate apostle because, number one, he did not follow Jesus in the flesh in Jesus' earthly ministry. He did not do that. But Paul says he did encounter the risen Jesus. Remember, on the road to Damascus, he didn't see him, but he heard him. So Paul's argument was that, no, I am a legitimate apostle. He named himself as an apostle because, number one, he says, I do know Jesus. I met him. I didn't follow him in his earthly ministry, but I met him on the road to Damascus, and he gave me the command to go into all the world. So I am a legitimate apostle. So that was Paul's defense, and you can read about that in the book of Acts, but you can also read about it in his letter to the Galatians and his first letter to the Corinthians. Paul says, I heard and I saw Christ. And he doesn't refer to Jesus, he doesn't use the name of Jesus a lot, he uses the word Christ. We'll talk about that in our next video. But he says, I may be one of the least of the apostles, but doggone it, I am an apostle. I am an apostle. I persecuted the church, but now I am an apostle. So he was very serious about it, and he was also very defensive, very defensive. Just a little tiny bit about Paul's early ministry, and this would be about the years 35, 38 AD, so approximately 3 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. Paul tells the Galatians, I did not go to Jerusalem to be with those who were apostles before me, but rather I went away to Arabia, which today would be considered Jordan, I believe, and then I returned to Damascus, and then 3 years later I went to Jerusalem. So Paul didn't right away run to Jerusalem and join up with the apostles there. He went away, and we believe that he studied and he learned and he prayed for 3 years, and then he went to Jerusalem and tried to claim his apostleship there. And of course he and Peter got into it a lot. They were always arguing about that, but eventually Peter did acknowledge him to be an apostle. Again, Paul would meet his death about the age in his late 50s or 60s. He died at the hands of the Romans, we believe, in Jerusalem. I believe most people think Paul was beheaded, again, for political sedition, because he went up against the Roman Empire. So after 3 years, he says, I did go to Jerusalem. There I met with Peter and James. Remember, James was the brother of Jesus. James was the first bishop of Jerusalem. They were the leaders of this church. And he went there to meet with them and to sort of sync up and get his orders and become a part of this ministry. So let's talk briefly about Paul's missionary journeys. And you can see some of those journeys on the screen. The first one was called the Cypro-Galatian mission. So Paul went to Cyprus and to Galatia, and he took with him his disciple Barnabas. We believe that this first journey probably occurred in the very early 40s. So that would have been 5-6 years following his Damascus Road experience. Paul hardly says a word about this first journey in his letters. He doesn't mention it a lot in his letters. But Luke did record it in the book of Acts, the 13th and the 14th chapter. It describes Paul's first missionary journey. Barnabas went to Tarsus, Paul's hometown, found him, and there they hooked up together and went on their way. In the book of Acts, it says that the people called Barnabas Zeus, a Greek god, and they called Paul, the Greek god, Hermes. Why did they call Paul Hermes? Because I guess the Greek god Hermes did a lot of talking and was very defensive, and so they decided that Paul was Hermes and Barnabas was Zeus, which is kind of funny. But those were their frame of reference, their cultural and religious frame of reference. They sailed from the little town of Antioch to the island of Cyprus, and then they just kept on going. They visited several cities, including Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, and then back to Perga. I believe all of those cities are located in the current modern-day country of Turkey. It would have been Turkey. They go to the synagogues in each of those cities. Again, these are Jews. They go to their Jewish synagogues, and they attempt to convince the Jews there that Jesus was their long-awaited Messiah. But guess what? It says Paul didn't have a lot of success in the synagogue. So what did he do? Enterprising, industrious Paul turned to the Gentiles and decided that God was trying to tell him to take the good news of God's grace and mercy to the Gentiles, the non-Jews. And he then became the apostle to the Gentiles. So the first missionary journey, he tried to preach in the synagogues, didn't go well. Then he decided, well, then I'm not going to waste my time there. I'm going to preach to the Gentiles. and apparently he was much more successful with the Gentiles. The second missionary journey is called the Aegean mission. This probably occurred in the late 40s and early 50s. He went on this missionary journey after what was the church's first big church fight, and that happened in Jerusalem, and the issue was Jewish circumcision. Again, the church was mostly made up of Jews, but slowly but surely more and more Gentiles were being attracted to the message. And Peter was telling them, well, if you're going to follow Jesus, he was a Jew, so you have to follow the Jewish dietary rules, and the men have to be circumcised. And so Paul and Peter got into this big hair pull, and Paul won, and the church council there decided that the men did not need to be circumcised, and that they did not have to follow the dietary rules to experience the grace of God. If the Jews wanted to do that, Paul was fine with it, but the Gentiles didn't. In other words, you don't have to do that. If you want to do it, if it's a part of your religious life, Paul said that's fine, but you cannot force Gentiles to become Jews and to follow those customs. And Paul won the argument. The third journey came in the late 50s, and it is believed that that's when Paul did a lot, or maybe most of his writing, his letter writing, occurred late in the late 50s, again, sort of later in his religious life too. So they were a little more theologically sophisticated. Paul tried to make it a point to revisit all the cities where he had founded churches, and you can tell in his letters, he would often say, "I long to see you again. I will come to you. I'm going to come to you." He wanted to go back and visit all these congregations that he founded on his second missionary journey. On the third journey, he wanted to try to get back, and he did for some and didn't make it to others. There's an interesting story that while Paul was in the city of Ephesus, that he got into big trouble because, and he was arrested there because he tried to bring a Gentile into the inner parts of a temple. He was put in prison for 2 years for that. And that's about the end of Paul's bio. The story in Acts ends with Paul, basically waiting in Jerusalem to be tried, to hear his trial. And who knows? I'm sure he was probably hoping that he would win and he wouldn't be executed, but he was very, very brave about all of it. But he waited. But we do know that he was executed in the city of Jerusalem, very likely beheaded as a Roman citizen, because it was considered kinder and gentler than being crucified. Okay, so that's it for today. So next week, then we will look at 3 or 4 of Paul's theological points that really he spent those journeys making to the Jews and to the Gentiles. Thank you, and have a great week. We'll see you then.